The thunder of hoofbeats shattered the desert silence like gunfire, and Gideon Mackenzie knew someone was going to die tonight. He pressed his weathered face against the small window of his dugout shelter, squinting through the moonless dark. The sound grew closer, not the rhythmic gallop of a single horse, but the desperate, uneven stumble of something wounded, something fleeing. His calloused fingers found the worn handle of his Colt revolver, muscle memory from a life he'd tried to bury in this godforsaken stretch of New Mexico territory. The hoofbeats stopped. Gideon held his breath, counting heartbeats in the sudden quiet. 1, 2, 3. Then came the sound that would haunt him forever, a soft, desperate tapping at his door, weak as a dying bird's wing against glass. He opened the door to find her collapsed against the wooden frame, a Comanche girl, no more than 16, her deerskin dress torn and darkened with blood. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, perhaps, but simply held out a small cloth bag, her dark eyes pleading in the lamplight that spilled from his doorway. The bag was soaked crimson, and as Gideon stared, a single drop fell to the dust at his boots. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they looked at each other across the chasm of everything that should have kept them apart. He was a white man in Comanche territory. She was a wounded girl from a people his own kind had been killing for generations. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to let the desert claim whatever tragedy had brought her here. But then she swayed, and he saw something in her face that shattered his resolve, the same look his wife Mary had worn in those final moments when fever had claimed her 3 winters past, the look of someone who had traveled too far, sacrificed too much, and had only one last hope left in the world. Gideon caught the girl as she fell. The story had begun 5 years earlier, when Gideon Mackenzie first arrived in this patch of nowhere with his wife Mary and a dream of honest work. He'd been a soldier once, had worn the blue uniform and carried the flag westward, but war had a way of hollowing a man out until all he wanted was peace. So when the railroad companies started hiring men to dig storm shelters and root cellars for the settlers pushing into Apache and Comanche lands, Gideon had taken the job gladly. It was simple work, the kind that let a man's soul heal while his hands stayed busy. Dig deep enough into the red earth, brace the walls with good timber, and create a place where families could weather the storms, both the ones that came from the sky and the ones that came from the tensions brewing between the expanding settlements and the native tribes whose ancestral lands they claimed. Mary had loved the work too. She'd had a gift with her hands, could weave grass and willow switches into baskets and decorations that made their simple dugout feel like a palace. More than that, she'd had a way of talking to people that could calm the wildest tempers. When disputes arose between settlers and tribal hunting parties, Mary would often broker peace with nothing more than a shared meal and her patient ear. It was Mary who had first taught him about the Comanche way of knotting grass into symbols, how a particular twist meant safe passage, how another meant a request for parley. She'd learned it from a Comanche woman named Ayana, who would sometimes trade herbs for ammunition when the winter grew harsh. The two women had developed a friendship that transcended the bloody history between their peoples, sharing stories and traditions across a fire built halfway between their worlds. Love finds a way, Mary used to say, working her fingers through the grass. When hearts are willing, love always finds a way. But fever had taken Mary that third winter, and with her had gone the bridge she'd built between worlds. Gideon had retreated deeper into his work, further from the settlements, until he was living in the very shelter he'd dug for a family that would never fill it. The railroad companies still paid him to dig more shelters, and he did, working mechanically through the days and drinking away the nights, existing in the liminal space between the white world that no longer felt like home and the native lands he could never truly enter. Now, as he carried the wounded Comanche girl into his shelter, all of Mary's lessons came flooding back. He laid her gently on his cot, the same bed where Mary had breathed her last, and for a moment the weight of grief and possibility nearly broke him. The girl's eyes fluttered open as he cleaned her wounds, a deep gash across her shoulder, another along her ribs. She'd been shot, he realized, the bullets having torn through her but not hitting anything vital. Lucky, if you could call it that. Easy now, he murmured, the same words he'd used to calm spooked horses and wounded soldiers. You're safe here. She didn't understand his words, but something in his voice seemed to reach her. She relaxed slightly, though her hand never left the blood-soaked cloth bag she'd been clutching. Gideon dressed her wounds as best he could, using strips torn from one of Mary's old dresses. The girl watched him work, and he found himself remembering Mary's gentle hands performing the same careful ministrations. When he was done, she pressed the cloth bag into his hands and spoke a single word in Comanche, Tanatsa. He didn't know the word, but the weight in her voice told him everything he needed to know. This was important. This was why she'd ridden through the night, bleeding and desperate. This was why she'd knocked on the door of a stranger who should have been her enemy. Inside the bag, wrapped in soft deerskin, was a child's moccasin, tiny, beaded with intricate patterns, stained with blood. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she looked at it, and Gideon understood. Someone had been lost. Someone small and precious had been taken from the world, and this girl had risked everything to carry this token to, what? Safety, ceremony, some kind of justice. He looked at her again, really looked, and saw past the blood and pain to the person beneath. She was beautiful in the way of wild things, fierce and fragile, strong and breakable. Her long black hair was braided with beads and feathers, and even wounded, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of noble blood. "I'll help you," he said quietly, not knowing if she understood but meaning every word. "Whatever you need, I'll help." She nodded once, then closed her eyes and slept. Gideon woke before dawn to the sound of absolute silence. It was wrong, that silence. Even in the deep desert, there were always sounds: wind through the sage, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. But now there was nothing, as if the entire world was holding its breath. He crept to the window and looked out into the gray pre-dawn light, and his blood turned to ice water in his veins. They were everywhere. Comanche warriors, maybe 70 of them, formed a perfect circle around his shelter. They sat their horses motionless as statues, painted for war, armed with rifles and lances and bows. But they weren't attacking, they weren't even moving. They simply sat there in the growing light, waiting. Gideon's hand went to his gun, then stopped. 70 warriors. Even if he had a dozen rifles and unlimited ammunition, the math was clear. If they wanted him dead, he'd already be dead, so why weren't they moving? As the sun climbed higher, one of the warriors dismounted and began to build a small fire. Soon the scent of burning sage and sweetgrass filled the air. Ceremonial incense, Gideon realized. They were holding some kind of ritual. But for what? The girl stirred on the cot, awakening to the smell of the sacred smoke. She tried to sit up, winced at the pain, but managed to make it to the window. When she saw the circle of warriors, her face went pale, but not with fear, with something deeper. Shame, maybe, or sorrow. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, words tumbling over each other like water over stones. Gideon caught the desperation in her voice, the pleading, but couldn't understand a word. She pointed at the tiny moccasin, then at herself, then at the warriors outside. "They're here for you," Gideon said, understanding finally clicking into place. "And for that." He nodded at the moccasin. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then she did something that nearly broke his heart. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest, over her heart, and then to his own. A gesture of connection, of trust, of something that transcended language. "You're not just any girl," he realized aloud. "You're someone important. A chief's daughter, maybe. And that moccasin." He looked at the tiny shoe, blood-stained and precious. That belonged to someone they loved, someone who's gone. The girl nodded again, and Gideon felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a mantle. This wasn't just about a wounded stranger anymore. This was about justice, about grief, about the terrible mathematics of loss that governed the frontier. Someone had taken a child from these people, and they wanted answers. They wanted the person responsible, and they thought it was him. The standoff stretched through the morning and into the afternoon. The warriors never moved from their positions, never spoke, never showed any sign of impatience or aggression. They simply waited, burning their incense and watching his door with the patience of men who had been waiting their entire lives for this moment. Inside the shelter, Gideon paced like a caged animal, while the girl watched him with growing distress. She kept trying to explain something, gesturing at the moccasin and then at the door, but the language barrier was insurmountable. He could see the frustration building in her eyes, the desperate need to communicate something vital. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Gideon made his decision. He couldn't stay trapped in here forever, and he couldn't let this girl suffer for whatever had happened to bring her to his door. If the warriors wanted to talk, he'd give them the chance. He moved to the corner where Mary's weaving supplies still sat, untouched since her death. Willow switches, grass stems, colored thread, the tools she'd used to create beauty in a harsh world. His hands, calloused and clumsy, remembered her patient instructions as he began to work. The girl watched in amazement as he wove a pattern she clearly recognized, the symbol Mary had taught him for peace, for forgiveness, for the hope that enemies might become friends. His fingers were awkward at first, but muscle memory guided him, and slowly the ancient symbol took shape. When he finished, the girl took the woven grass from his hands and held it to her heart, tears streaming down her face. She spoke a word he didn't understand, but her meaning was clear. Yes. Gideon walked out of his shelter, carrying the grass symbol like a white flag, his heart hammering against his ribs. The circle of warriors watched him approach, and he felt the weight of 70 pairs of eyes measuring his every step. The warrior who had built the fire, an older man with streaks of gray in his long hair and scars that spoke of a lifetime of battles, rode forward to meet him. This was their leader, Gideon realized. Probably the girl's father or uncle. The man's eyes were hard as flint, but when he saw the grass symbol in Gideon's hands, something shifted in his expression. Gideon held out the symbol and spoke the one word of Comanche he remembered Mary teaching him. Pahabya, peace. The leader stared at him for a long moment, then dismounted. He was a tall man, dignified and imposing, and when he spoke his English was accented but clear. You know our ways, he said, his voice like gravel and wind. How? My wife, Gideon replied simply. She learned from your people. She believed in peace between our worlds. The leader nodded slowly. Where is this wife? Dead. 3 winters passed. Something flickered in the older man's eyes, not sympathy exactly, but recognition, the understanding of one who had also lost what he loved most. I am Quanah, the leader said. The girl is my daughter, Ayana. She carries the moccasin of my grandson, killed by white men 2 days ago during a raid on our village. The name hit Gideon like a physical blow. Ayana, the same name as the woman who had been Mary's friend, who had taught her the Comanche ways of knotting grass and making peace. This was her daughter. I didn't know, Gideon said, his voice thick with sudden emotion. I didn't know she was Ayana's daughter. Quanah's eyes widened slightly. You knew my wife. She was my wife's friend. They traded stories and wisdom. Mary always spoke of her with great respect. For a moment the weight of coincidence, or perhaps something deeper than coincidence, hung in the air between them. Then Quanah spoke again, his voice softer now. My daughter followed the tracks of the killers to your door. The child's blood led here. Gideon felt the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Someone came through here. Someone wounded, maybe carrying. He couldn't finish the sentence. My grandson, Quanah said quietly, taken alive from our village. We found his body this morning, at the bottom of Black Canyon, with the rest of the children they stole. The silence that followed was deeper than any Gideon had ever experienced. In it, he heard the echo of every atrocity committed in the name of progress, every act of violence that had built the bridge of blood between his people and theirs. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. I'm so sorry for your loss. Quanah nodded, accepting the grief that transcended all boundaries of race and tribe. The men who did this, they stopped here. My daughter is certain. She followed their tracks, found drops of my grandson's blood at your door. They didn't come inside, Gideon said quickly. I swear to you, they never came inside. I would have. He stopped, realizing how empty any promise sounded in the face of such loss. I know, Quanah said simply. If you had been part of this, your shelter would be ashes, and your bones would feed the coyotes. But my daughter, she sees things others do not. She says you have a good heart. She says your wife's spirit guided her here. That night, as the warriors made their camp in a respectful circle around his shelter, Gideon sat by Ayana's bedside and told her about Mary. He spoke of their friendship, of the bridge they had built between worlds, of the hope they had shared for a future where their peoples might find peace. Ayana listened with growing wonder, and though she couldn't understand his words, she seemed to understand his heart. When he finished, she reached into her medicine bag and pulled out a small braid of sweetgrass, tied with colored thread in a pattern he recognized. Your mother made this, he said, and she nodded, tears in her eyes. She pressed it into his hands, then pointed to her heart and then to his. Another gift across the divide, another thread in the tapestry of connection that somehow survived all the violence and hatred. The next morning, Quanah and his warriors prepared to leave. They had found what they came for, not the killers themselves, but the knowledge that some bridges still stood, that some spaces remained sacred, even in a world gone mad with blood and vengeance. Before mounting his horse, Quanah clasped Gideon's hand in the warrior's grip. You will always be welcome at our fires, he said, you and the memory of your wife. Ayana was the last to leave. Her wounds had healed enough for travel, and she moved with the natural grace of her people. But before mounting her horse, she came to Gideon and spoke in careful English, the words clearly practiced. Your wife, she lives in you, in the peace you make. Then she was gone, riding away with her father and the other warriors, leaving only the smell of sage smoke and the memory of connection in the desert air. Winter came early that year, and with it the loneliness that had been Gideon's constant companion since Mary's death. He continued his work, digging shelters for settlers who needed protection from the storms, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The encounter with Ayana and her people had awakened something in him, a longing for connection, for purpose beyond mere survival. He found himself thinking often of Mary's words, love finds a way. But what kind of love could bridge the gap between worlds at war? What kind of love could survive the hatred and violence that seemed to define the frontier? The answer came with the first snow of December. Gideon woke one morning to find his usual pile of firewood had been disturbed. At first he thought it might have been animals, but as he gathered the logs, something caught his eye, a small object wrapped in deerskin, hidden beneath the wood pile. With trembling hands he unwrapped the bundle and found a necklace of intricate beadwork, the pattern unlike anything he'd ever seen. But it wasn't the beauty of the piece that made his breath catch in his throat. It was the way it was knotted, with the exact same technique Mary had used, the same loops and twists that had been her signature. There was no note, no explanation, just the necklace and the knowledge that someone had been watching, someone had remembered, someone had cared enough to create this bridge between worlds. Gideon sank to his knees in the snow, clutching the necklace to his chest, and for the first time since Mary's death he wept, not from grief, but from gratitude. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, Ayanna lived and remembered. Somewhere, the friendship between two women from different worlds had planted seeds that would bloom in unexpected places. Epilogue. Years later, when the Indian Wars finally ended, and the frontier became something tamer and more civilized, Gideon Mackenzie would tell this story to anyone who would listen. He'd show them the necklace, still bright and beautiful after all those years, and he'd speak of the lesson it taught him about love and loss and the connections that bind all hearts together. He never saw Ayanna again, but he heard stories sometimes of a Comanche woman who worked as a translator and peacekeeper, who helped broker treaties and build bridges between the white settlements and her people. The stories always mentioned her wisdom and her gift for seeing the humanity in everyone, even former enemies. And Gideon would smile when he heard these tales, because he knew the truth that love transcended all boundaries, not just the boundaries between peoples and nations, but the boundaries between life and death, between past and future, between what was lost and what could still be found. In the end, Mary had been right. Love always found a way. Sometimes it came as a wounded stranger at your door. Sometimes it came as a moment of understanding between enemies. And sometimes, when you needed it most, it came as a simple gift left in a pile of wood, knotted with the memory of hands that had taught you how to make peace in a world at war. The necklace was proof that some promises never die, that some bridges never truly burn, and that in the vast and often cruel wilderness of the human heart, there always remained small sanctuaries of grace, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to open their doors to hope.